Okay, so I decided just to record my lectures by myself. I'm not sending Zoom invitations anymore for the lectures, but I will be sending a Zoom invitation for the discussion on Friday. There weren't enough people attending the Zoom lectures to justify sending an invitation every time I did one. So I'm just doing them when they're convenient for me. And then I'll upload the video to your site so you can look at the videos. See, this is a more convenient time for Cody too. All right, so ah, all right, he's very wet. So today, again, I'll invite you to the Zoom discussion for Friday, but I'm not. I'm just gonna. There's not going to be Zoom invitations for the lectures anymore. Usually there was only one person there, and not even that sometimes. Okay, so today the topic is the first topic in chapter 23, which is Dada. And the second topic of chapter 23 will be surrealism, but we'll talk about that I'll post that lecture by Monday. So your discussion question should be about either Dada from chapter 23 or Cubism from chapter 22. Sorry that we can't do one chapter per week, but the schedule just doesn't work out that way, so it's a little confusing sometimes. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so your book calls this chapter 23, it calls it Between the Wars, which is kind of a sad name for a chapter. Like, there's a war, and then there's a little period of time between the wars, and then there's another war, then another between the wars. But the two wars that it's talking about are World War I and World War II. So World War I was from 1914 to 1918, and World War II was from 1939 to 45. And fortunately, there hasn't been another World War since then. It's not too late. There could be another one. There's been what's so-called proxy wars ever since World War II for reasons that we'll discuss later. But this is not really a history course. This is art history course. But history obviously affects art, as we discussed earlier. That's the context within which all these artworks are created. And that's especially important for Dada because it was deeply affected. That it's an art movement that wouldn't have happened without World War I, probably. All right, so here's the confusing Barr diagram again. B-A-R-R. Alfred Barr being the director of the Museum of Modern Art for a long time. And he had this kind of maybe slightly, well, you're going to laugh when I say this, oversimplified version of what modern art was. It doesn't look simple, but I mean, he divided abstract art into non-geometrical and geometrical abstract art. Cubism being the geometrical kind, and Fauvism, Expressionism being the non-geometrical kind. But there's still a lot of so-called modernisms that don't really neatly fall into one of either non-geometric or geometrical because there's some forms of 20th century art that are not abstract, especially. They're more representational, or maybe those terms don't even apply to them. So you'll see what I mean when we get in. And that's what we're talking about today is Dada, which he sort of puts over here with Expressionism and Surrealism. And maybe that makes a certain sense. But I really just think of Dada and Surrealism as the other modernisms. Like, yes, surrealist paintings are sometimes abstract, but sometimes not at all. So it doesn't really fit into those two sort of bins, you could say. All right, so we have to talk about World War I for a minute just to understand what Dada was coming out of. So this is kind of a general map of Europe and Russia and parts of the Middle East um, on the eve of World War One in 1914. So um, there was this big political entity in 19 before 1914 called the Austria-Hungary Austria-Hungarian Empire, and it doesn't exist anymore. it it stopped existing after World War One and was broken up into a lot of smaller countries, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc. But it was allied with Germany, which was kind of semi-unified by this time. It had been a bunch of little states and principalities that were kind of unified by 1914, and Italy. And these central powers, as they're sometimes called, or as they're called here, the Triple Alliance, had a sort of arms race with the rest of the world, or with the rest of Europe, including France, the United Kingdom, and Russia. And the truth is, although we say that World War One started because of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo, the real reason is not. I've read several books about the causes of World War One, and there's no real. I mean, scholars are still arguing about why it happened, but it seems to have kind of happened because of this arms race that got out of control, and it just it had a sort of momentum and logic of its own, to the point that eventually the Germans invaded Belgium and the Netherlands and came into France here, and the French sort of stopped them there by building a line of trenches, but that the trench warfare went on for 4 years before the United States finally joined the Triple Entente, and the invention of tanks made it possible for the Triple Entente, or the Allies, as we sometimes call, to break the impasse there. There was also the so-called Eastern Front over here, where the Germans were fighting the Russians until the Russian Revolution happened, and then Russia sort of got out of the war. So, so it was the main thing to know about World War One was that it was a very bloody and protracted and crazy kind of war that had never been seen before in Europe. I mean, Europe had had the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century, but Europe had been fairly peaceful since then. And the mass slaughter of World War One sort of took Europeans by surprise, it seems. What happened again was that the soldiers ended up in trenches along these lines, two lines of trenches. On one side, the French and the British, until the Americans came into the war. But America didn't enter the war until 1917. And then the Eastern Front over here. So the trench warfare was mainly along this line here in sort of northeastern France. And, you know, it rained, there was mud, people literally drowned sometimes in the mud. The battles were different than in the Napoleonic Wars, to say the least. What would happen is the soldiers would just come out of the trenches and march across this wasteland that was known as no man's land into machine gun fire. So they would just get mowed down by the machine guns in a pointless way. Some of the battles went on for days, and in one battle, the Battle of the Somme, the United Kingdom, the British forces lost 60,000 guys in one day. That's as many people, that's the same number of people that died in the whole Vietnam War, which lasted 10 years. So it was a whole generation of men, European men, were slaughtered in World War One. There's just no other way to put it. And the rest of them came back with terrible injuries that people just hadn't seen in war before, basically because of machine guns and shelling and um, types of weapons that hadn't really existed before World War One. So this picture is from a battle called the Battle of Verdun towards the end of the war, where the Germans intended to throw all their troops at this one place along the line, and as they put it, bleed France dry. Just they knew that the French, for various cultural reasons, would not want to lose Verdun, and so they thought that if they just threw everything at them at Verdun, that the French would just fold. But that didn't happen. They just got slaughtered, but they hung tough, so you could say. The same with the Battle of the Somme. Okay, so one reason I'm interested in World War I, besides the huge effect that it had not only on visual art but also on literature, is that my grandfather was a soldier in World War I, but he was not a combat soldier. He was a ambulance driver, and this is his class at the University of the South in June of 1917. So he was in college when World War I started, and his entire class, this is them, signed up to go to France, and some of them were in the Swanee ambulance unit. So they left college in June. They went straight to Pennsylvania, where they were trained. I can't show you exactly which one is him in these pictures, but anyway, he was. This is them in their uniforms that they wore during the whole war, and these uniforms were not comfortable. They were green wool jackets. At least the one that I've seen was really scratchy. Doesn't look comfortable at all. Anyway, they were trained at Allentown in Pennsylvania, and then they went overseas on a ship with the parts for their Ford ambulances. And then when they got to France, they assembled the ambulances and learned to drive. Most of them had never driven a car before. In 1917, not many people had cars. So they had to learn how to put the cars together, maintain the cars, and drive the cars, and keep meticulous records about the cars. And my grandfather kept meticulous records about his cars for the rest of his life. That early training kind of stuck. Okay, so they went to France, and he was in France until when the armistice happened on November 11th, 1918. Today is Armistice Day, which means, well, it's now called Veterans Day, but let's just go back to this slide. Armistice Day was the day that the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, when the guns went silent along the Western Front, and basically the Allied powers won over the Germans. And that's why we have Veterans Day on November 11th. It's become a larger holiday that doesn't just commemorate people who fought in World War I, but all wars. Okay, so this crazy war that slaughtered so many European men for no apparent reason, because at the end of the war, the boundaries of the countries were pretty much the same as they had been before the war. The ridiculousness of this and the barbarism of it made a lot of artists totally rethink the whole idea of Western civilization, you could say. So while World War I was raging in Europe, some artists went to Switzerland. So here's Switzerland right here. It's in Europe, but it was neutral during World War I and World War II. In fact, when my grandfather went on leave, he was always right sort of in this area. He went to Switzerland. He loved it. I think he went skiing. This is pretty weird for a boy from South Carolina, you know. In fact, he was totally amazed by Europe generally, by the food, the opera. He loved the opera in Paris. Anyway, he had never been outside of Tennessee or South Carolina, and all of that was pretty amazing to him. So a lot of European artists sort of ran away from the slaughter, you could say, and ended up in Switzerland, including Hugo Ball, who was a French artist. And they just totally rethought the whole idea of visual art, away from painting and even modernist painting like Cubism or Fauvism, and started thinking, you know, why do we even make art? I mean, we think of art as a kind of cultural achievement, but Western culture has just gone crazy. There, you know, people are just being gunned down en masse for no apparent reason. So Dada was kind of a reaction against that. It questioned the existence of the sort of primacy of science and reason and logic as the cornerstones of European culture, because clearly those institutions had failed. In the 19th century, toward the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century, there was this kind of faith in progress and in democracy and in science and nation states. But, you know, that faith seemed really misplaced by 1916. So these artists got together in Zurich, in Switzerland, and began to do what we would now call performance art. That is, a kind of art that wasn't painting or sculpture. It was a kind of absurd performance where performers would wear these bizarre costumes and just sort of make noises and recite nonsense poems. So here's a statement from the Dada Manifesto. This is sort of the beginning of the age of manifestos, that is, statements of artistic philosophy, you could say. So I'm just going to read it. I normally give students a handout with this stuff on it, but we can't do that right now. So maybe I'll put the handout in the content. But Dada knows everything. Dada spits on everything. Dada says no thing. Dada has no fixed ideas. Dada does not catch flies. Dada is bitterness laughing at everything that has been accomplished, sanctified. Dada is never right. No more painters, no more writers, no more religions, no more royalists, no more anarchists, no more socialists, no more police, no more airplanes, no more urinary passages. Like everything in life, Dada is useless. Everything happens in an idiotic way. We are incapable of treating seriously any subject whatsoever, let alone this subject ourselves. So I think one key phrase here is everything happens in an idiotic way. So it seemed like the world had become idiotic. So art kind of imitates life. I mean, you know, a painting of a still life, it's like, it says, this is what reality looks like, a table with some fruit and flowers on it. And the Dada people are saying, this is what reality looks like now. Everything happens in an idiotic way. So that's how art is going to be from now on. Okay, but as frequently happens, there were intimations, that is, hints that this kind of thing was coming even before World War I began. And I think that's important to notice because I feel like a lot of times art and artists are a little bit ahead of the game, so to speak. Like artists kind of pick up on things that maybe other people have not yet noticed and start making art about those things before they're really obvious. And that was the case, especially with Marcel Duchamp, who was a French artist who by 1913 was already saying that painting is over. And he started making these art objects that he called ready-mades by just buying things or finding things and sticking them together, so to speak. Like in this case, a bicycle wheel mounted upside down on a kind of a bar stool or something. I think it's kind of cool. I would want one of those. So this wasn't totally out of the blue in the sense that Picasso and Braque, as you saw in the last lecture, were already using found materials, newspapers, um, bits of wood grain paper and oilcloth and things like that. They were already collaging found things onto their so-called fine art paintings. And Duchamp just sort of took that idea, I think, to the next level. Like he didn't paint or draw anything on the painting. I mean, Picasso and Braque would still take a piece of charcoal and make a drawing on the newspaper. But Duchamp is just taking objects that he either found or bought and putting them together in a type of sculpture. Well, it's sort of like Picasso's guitar, really. It's a type of sculpture called assemblage. That is, it's not formed from clay through an additive process. It's not cut away with a chisel like a marble sculpture. It's assembled from sometimes just found things like stuff at the dump. You could do this. You could go to the dump and just find things and make stuff out of them. That would be assemblage. And you know, when I was going to an art school in Houston, there was a course on assemblage. I didn't take it, but it would have been fun. But what Duchamp basically was asserting that art is about ideas. It's not just about the elements of art like lines, colors, shapes, masses, space, or just about composition, unity and variety, symmetry, asymmetry. He's saying no, art has always been about ideas. Renaissance art was about ideas about Bible stories. The Greeks, when they made art, it was about ideas about power and the gods and their own history. So, you know, this strictly formalist idea it seemed like Cubism was going for, that art is about art, that is about the elements of art. He's saying that's BS. So what is his idea? His big idea is that the whole idea that he's asking a lot of questions. So let's just go to the next object and you'll see. All right, so this is probably Marcel Duchamp's most famous work, piece, you could say. So he submitted it to an art show and it was rejected. He submitted it as sculpture. So if you've ever been in a men's room, which I realize some people may not have been in a men's room. I don't go in the men's room, but I know that this is a urinal because men have told me that's what it is. All right, so he bought a urinal. He went to a plumbing store and he bought a urinal and he rotated it 180 degrees, I guess you could say. So normally the bottom is here. This is where you pee. And the water to kind of flush it comes in there from the top. So he's kind of rotated it 180 and then mounted it on its back, sort of. Well, I'll just show you. I'll go to a joke that I have here. Okay, so this is what they're normally supposed to look like. And somebody who wrote here, Duchamp was here. He took the urinal. He needed it, okay? But actually, he just bought it at a plumbing supply store. And then he signed it with a pseudonym, R. Mutt, and put 1917 on it. So by this time, World War I is underway and the United States is about to enter the war. But it was rejected from this art show. And he wrote a pretty angry letter to the people who organized the show about why they should have accepted his art piece. He says, and they apparently rejected it because he didn't make it. He bought it. So he says, whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life and this is really important, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view. He created a new thought for that object. Okay, so this part about usefulness is important. When you make something that's useful, like when I make a cup towel on my loom or something that I'm going to use in the kitchen, most people don't think of that as art. For art to be art, it has to be kind of useless. It's just for hanging on the wall, like this fine art photograph behind me. It's not, well, I can't really reach them right now, but I have some hand-woven pillows lying on the floor here that I made. So maybe some people would say, okay, well, that's arts and crafts. But for a long time, the kind of definition of art is it has no use other than aesthetic. That is, it's just for you to look at. And if it were useful, it would then become a tool or something. So it's not, for example, a urinal is not considered a work of art, no matter how beautiful it may be, because it's a piece of plumbing, like a washing machine or something. So Duchamp is sort of questioning that, as well as the idea that art has to be made by the artist's hands. Okay, now here's again, there's a lot of text here because this is from one of the handouts that I usually give people. One of the huge ironies about Fountain is that it's a very famous work of art and a very important work of art, but the original one has disappeared. So there have been replicas made, believe it or not, under Duchamp's supervision. So now I think there's 4 museums in the world where you can see a replica of the original fountain, mounted more or less the way Duchamp mounted the original fountain. And you won't be surprised to learn that performance artists, the descendants of Hugo Ball at the Cabaret Voltaire, have tried to pee in it. Of course. How could you not? But in some case, that's happened, I think it happened in the 90s, and then, well, if you look at Wikipedia, you can read all about that. But under the entry about Fountain or Duchamp or something like that. But anyway, but some of the newer ones are enclosed in plexiglass, so it's not that easy to pee in it. And one guy actually peed into a little container, took it to the museum, and somehow got a hose between the gap in the glass, and he snaked that hose in there and then poured the pee in there. So he could say that he peed into the urinal. So, and that's a very Dada thing to do. I mean, before Dada, no one really thought of performances like that as art. But now we do, we'll talk more about performance art in the last few lectures in this course, because that's a very late 20th century, early 21st century thing to do. Okay, so again, this raises a lot of questions about what is art. And this critic, Stephen Hicks, wrote a really good essay about that that's in the Khan Academy site. And this is a quote from that essay. So Duchamp is making some assertions about art. The artist is not a great creator. Duchamp went shopping at a plumbing store. The artwork is not a special object. it was mass produced in a factory. The experience of art is not exciting and ennobling. At best, it's puzzling and mostly leaves one with a sense of distaste. But over and above that, Duchamp did not select just any ready-made object to display. In selecting the urinal, his message was clear. Art is something you piss on. So there couldn't be a more Dada gesture than that. It's sort of like saying Western civilization, F you. You know, you killed millions of people in France, England, and Germany, and some Americans for no reason at all. You know, Western civilization basically kind of pissed on humanity. So art is just gonna, so we're just gonna piss on art. That's sort of how I read it. And I think that's fair. I mean, if you read some of the accounts of World War One, and I have read my grandfather's letters about World War One, it was so unbelievably horrible that, and in the aftermath, you know, all these men came back from the war with, you know, horrible injuries, no arms, no legs, half their face blown off. There was nobody for European women to marry because all the men were dead. I mean, it was just, it's hard for us to imagine how horrible it was, I think. But a little research will reveal that. And just the way people died, just a lot of them just drowning in the mud at Passchendaele during the Battle of the Somme. It was crazy. It was insane. Everything happens in an idiotic way. It certainly did. So why should art pretend that that didn't happen? Okay, so we're going to skip the snow shovel thing by Marcel Duchamp because there's a great video in the content where the art historians talk to Sal Khan, who started the Khan Academy, and he's really a mathematician, and a programmer, not an art critic. So you should definitely watch that video. All right, so now we're going to look at another object by Marcel Duchamp. So you should recognize this. It's a reproduction of Leonardo da Vinci's painting, the Mona Lisa, which had been in the Louvre in Paris for a while when World War I broke out. And it had actually been stolen from the Louvre and then returned to the Louvre after a while. They found it. And that's when it got stolen. That's when it became a really famous painting that French people were very attached to and considered, you know, one of their great national treasures and all that. So Duchamp takes a postcard or reproduction of the Mona Lisa, not in color maybe, and he draws a little mustache on it. Something maybe you did when you were a little kid. Drawing mustaches on pretty ladies is kind of fun. And then, just to add insult to injury, he writes LHOQ right here. So what does that mean? Well, if you say that fast in French, LHOQ, it means, and sorry, this is just what it means. She has a hot ass. So I'm sorry if that offends you, but that's what it means. So this was like another slap in the face to sort of defenders of Western civilization, you could say. I see your Mona Lisa and I'm going to just desecrate her with this mustache and I'm going to sexualize her and basically say she's a slut, blah, blah, blah. You know, this is pretty provocative. And this sort of, you could say, well, that's just silly. And it kind of is silly. But everything happens in an idiotic way. And did anybody die because of this act? No. How many people died in World War I? Millions. Millions. A third of the men in France between the ages of 16 and 55 were dead, and the rest of them were mutilated or had terrible PTSD, which back then was called shell shock, and it wasn't really recognized as a legitimate disability. In fact, there was no real disability back then. People, you know, disabled soldiers sometimes ended up homeless, like Vietnam vets shamefully have in our country. So, you could say, well, Duchamp is just making fun of something beautiful, the Mona Lisa. Well, it's not really the Mona Lisa that it's aimed at. It's aimed at this sort of self-important so-called Western civilization that had just kind of committed suicide and ruined the lives of millions of people for no apparent reason. And it had a huge, one of them, in art historical terms, what's important about this is what a huge effect Dada and this kind of art had on later generations of artists. It's impossible to understand contemporary art, that is art that's being made now in the 21st century, without knowing about Dada, because these sort of provocative, in-your-face FU gestures are a big part of contemporary art now and have been for a while, since the 70s, really. Okay, so we're going to look at one more object, sort of Dada object. And that is another assemblage. This is kind of it's not really a ready-made in the sense that, well, I guess it is, that Hausmann, who was a German, took things that he had found, like Duchamp did, and put them together. And this is a practice that the Surrealists, which we're going to talk about next week, took and ran with that practice of taking disparate things and sort of attaching them to each other to make a new thing, a surrealist object. This, for whatever reason, is categorized as a kind of Dada work of art. So what is it? So it's a wooden head, but it's not, Hausmann didn't carve the head himself. He bought it, or found it in a flea market or something. It's a mannequin head. Presumably, it was once in a shop window and it had a hat, to sell hats. And he's attached all kinds of things to this mannequin head. He's attached a ruler and some gears over here, maybe from a camera or something. There's a nail on either side of the head, sort of like the bolts in Frankenstein's head. There's a number 22 on his forehead. There's kind of tape measure glued to his head. Maybe that was originally there as part of the hat size measurement. There's a little tin cup on the top of his head that has a little heart engraved in it. There's the insides of a pocket watch, and then there's a typewriter cylinder in a little case glued to the other side. So his ears are sort of represented by these gears and machine parts. And then on the back, there's an alligator skin wallet sort of glued to the back of his head. So there's a really good video in the link to in the content that links you to the Khan Academy site about this head that zooms in on it, and you can see the back of it and everything. And the art historians talk about it in a very interesting way. But the upshot of what they talk about is, again, this is a response to World War I, which had just ended in 1919. Hausmann, again, he was a German guy. He lived in Berlin. Berlin was a center of Dada. So Dada was an international movement. There was Paris Dada. It started in Switzerland, in Zurich. So there was Zurich Dada. There was Paris Dada. There was Berlin Dada, which was really important and flourishing for a long time. And even New York Dada, of which Duchamp was a part. So Haussmann was part of Berlin Dada. And you can see, I mean, nowadays, as the art historians say in the video, the idea that we're sort of part human, part machine is kind of almost a cliche because, you know, we go around with our phones next to us all the time. The phone is a machine, and you know, it's almost attached to our ears or our bodies, and uh, you know, data is constantly being implanted in our ears and in our eyes from other places. And the fact that humans are more like robots, maybe, than they were 50 years ago, or definitely more than 100 years ago. And this was made almost exactly 100 years ago, is amazingly prophetic in a way, because I think we sort of have acknowledged now that humans have become more integrated into the kind of machine world than ever before. But, you know, the Industrial Revolution was not as progressed in 1919 as it is now. Although, you know, the Industrial Revolution was part of the reason for the carnage of World War One. It was the first industrial war where killing was done on an industrial scale. That is, by machines, machine guns, which could fire, you know, hundreds of rounds very quickly. I mean, you know, everybody has a gun like that now. I bet some people watching this lecture have a gun like that. I know you don't call it a machine gun, but I've heard them going off in my neighborhood and they can fire an awful lot of rounds in a very short amount of time. But that was new in World War One, and it was shocking to people. And, you know, soldiers were made to march into machine gun fire like that, which is why the Somme and the Battle of Verdun and all of that were so deadly. So here you have this sort of representation of a human in this world, in this machine age, where the guns are machine guns. They're hardly even fired by humans. You don't even have to aim. You don't need any skill to operate one of these machine gun nests that existed in World War One. You just sit up there and go like that. I'm sure you've seen movies where that's going on. So, you know, and everybody is measured, right? He's got this tape measure on his brain. Every time you take a standardized test where you fill in little bubbles and then they give you a number, it's like your brain is being measured, right? Maybe that's what this yardstick is there for. And what's this little bowler hat that's actually a cup? Maybe it's a funnel that people pour knowledge or what they want you to know into your brain. And this little typewriter cylinder over here, maybe that's just print media sort of going directly from the newspaper into your head. I mean, obviously the internet didn't exist by this time. Television didn't exist by this time. Radio was just getting started. But nevertheless, mass media in the sense of newspapers distributed, you know, to everybody and indoctrinating people into whatever the nation state wanted you to believe, those definitely existed. So, so I think that this object still has a lot of resonance in the 21st century. It's amazing. The fact that this person is anonymous also I think is important. His eyes are blank, you know, his eyes are open, but there's no facial expression. He's not an individual. He's just a mass man. You know, he's just part of an army, either an industrial army or a military army. And what's the difference? Because, you know, all the factory workers of the industrial age in England and to a lesser degree in France and Germany, you know, they just took all those guys who had been working on assembly lines and just well, maybe they weren't working on assembly lines yet, but they were minding machines in textile mills and stuff. They just took all those people who had been part of the industrial machine and made them part of a military machine in which they were pulverized, just crushed to nothing. Their bodies just disappeared. They were blown up by grenades or smothered by mud. So the horror of the kind of industrial destruction of World War One is kind of neatly summed up by this object. I feel like it's the dehumanizing effect of being marched into machine gun fire, and soldiers from World War One describe that feeling of being sheep, just sort of herded into the machine guns. In fact, there was one incident where French soldiers um, started going bah, bah, when they were marched out. They were told to go over the top, that is, come out of the trenches, march across no man's land into machine gun fire. They went bah, bah, because they were sheep to the slaughter. And eventually there were troop mutinies as well, where they just refused to go over the top. They said, we're not gonna quit. We're not gonna run away, but we're not gonna go over the top anymore. And I think the commanders eventually uh, just had to go along with that. Sometimes they shot people who refused to go over the top. That happened amongst the English troops anyway. But the impasse finally was the stalemate was finally broken by tanks that on the Allied side that rolled over the trenches and eventually defeated the Germans. So if you want to know more about that, you can read up about it on the internet. But for the purposes of art history, the important thing is just the absurdity and waste and idiocy of World War One and how artists reacted to that. Okay, so I'm gonna stop my screen share. Okay, so that's all I have to say. I forgot to disable my weather radio. Fortunately, it didn't go off. All right, so I will hopefully see you on at the Zoom discussion meeting on Friday. Bye.